Hello, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to McDuff Lives. And another welcome to our good friend Nick Petoskey, Nick from Twitter, who is joining us tonight to talk about a very important subject, one that's been uh, highlighted in a lot of people's threads that are following the various virus and vaccine issues that the country is facing. And that is SV40, the Simian virus 40, that has been accused of being carcinogenic and accused of, well, causing or potentially causing, thousands and even millions of people to suffer cancer and perhaps even die from it. So uh, I've started looking into this matter because, as you know, my dad, who we call McDuff on the show, his real name, Tom O'Loughlin, uh, was uh, an important person in the Pentagon who I am very suspicious of the way he died, in that as he was first hired at the Pentagon, somehow he came down with a case of hepatitis that was really severe just during the first couple of weeks when he was hired, so he wasn't able to show up for work for like a month. He did survive it and he did come back and do very well at his job, but then he died of cancer in 1971, June 6th of 1971. And I've always been suspicious of the story, and I've been suspicious of the fact that nobody would ever explain anything to us about my dad's career or what may have killed him. And in that, I was somehow in my research came across the book Dr. Mary's Monkey, and I thought, well, that's interesting. The idea of cancer-causing monkey viruses in New Orleans. Well, if my father was somehow poisoned with cancer or something that gave him cancer, and if he had enemies, which probably were in the CIA, right? Um, they would have known about this. I mean, and as we know in hindsight, Alan Dulles made a very important, made a huge deal about trying to collect all the poisons that they could, just to have them on the shelf. Well, the idea took hold in me, and I purchased the book, and my copy of it here is dated in 2015. So I had it way back then. In 2017, I was starting to treat for prostate cancer, and I I was lucky to have found it. The prostate cancer uh, was detected in a PSA test in which the normal is supposed to be less than 4, and I was almost at 12. And so the doctor I saw, we had to intervene. And so, I do believe they saved my life by doing that. I'll go through the treatment some other time, but the idea of this SV40 comes from the fact that I did take one of those sugar cubes, as we all did in the early 60s, lined up in this school auditorium. And, when it was your turn, you were given a sugar cube and you ate it. And that's the basis of the story of Dr. Mary's Monkey. I just want to read and a little bit from the book here, and Nick will indulge me while I do this, and then we'll get into an open discussion. This is page 207 from the 2014 edition of Dr. Mary's Monkey by Ed Haslam, and the text is: In June 1959, Bernice Eddy, who was still officially assigned to the vaccine project, began thinking about the polio vaccine again. This time she was worried about something much deeper than polio. The vaccine's manufacturers had grown their polio viruses on the kidneys of monkeys. And when they removed the polio virus from the monkey's kidneys, they also removed an unknown number of other monkey viruses. The more they looked, the more they found. The medical science of the day knew little about the behavior or consequences of these monkey viruses, but times were changing. Confronted with mounting evidence that some monkey viruses caused cancer, Eddie grew suspicious of the polio vaccine and asked an excruciating question. Had they inoculated an entire generation of Americans with cancer causing monkey viruses? Well, that's the question. And when I think about this research and all the work that Nick has done, and I'm just looking forward to diving into this with Nick, I have to say that while I am getting terrific care and I'm feeling very confident that I'm not going to die and that things are somehow going to work out for me, um, the vast majority of those people, all those Americans of my generation that took that sugar cube, let's say being vaccine, and if they were exposed, and it appears that many of them were, perhaps a third or more of them, or if not all of them, and we just don't know right now, I don't think we know, but this is hundreds of thousands of people. And I think that these people need to know if, in fact, this has been the result of some type of experimentation of a biowarfare type of nature. Um, the implication of major commentators about it is kind of somewhere between, well, it didn't, there's no reason to worry about it. They don't have any proof of, causation. That kind of cautious and, kind of avuncular sounds like Fauci to me anymore, because we know that they know things that they don't tell us that they knew. And maybe just one more snippet from this book, and then I'll turn it over for a minute to our friend Nick. Let's see. We were in. Let's see. When injected with SV40, these clean African green monkeys developed cancer. In other words, they decided to test this on monkeys themselves. Hilleman, this is Maurice Hilleman, famous virologist, announced these findings at a medical conference in Copenhagen, but it was not news to the NIH staffers in the audience. The insiders already knew there was a cancer-causing virus in the polio vaccine, but they had not announced it. It was the public that did not know. Should the public have been told? It is difficult for us who have seen the enormous press coverage of AIDS to understand the indolent response of the 1960s press on this subject. Was it really their job to prevent public panic? Did they cower in the face of scientific authority? Were they lazy or stupid or arrogant? Or were they told not to run the story by political forces? It is hard to say, but there is evidence that the word leaked out anyway. So this is how we have to do this. We have to pull out all the evidence that we can and try to let all of those hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people know. And, without doing another piece of research or looking at all into it, I would say anyone that took that sugar cube, if you're male, be sure and get your PSA checked and monitor these things. The four soft tissue cancers that Ed Haslam in his book mentioned are skin cancer, myeloma, lymphoma, prostate cancer, and breast cancer. And certainly breast cancer has been a horrible, horrible problem as well as the others. So, okay, so that's where this is how I got into it. Since then, I have had the pleasure of interviewing Ed Haslam, the author, in his home down in Florida. And I try to keep abreast of what's going on. But wow, a lot of other people are working on SV40 right now. And so maybe we're going to have a breakthrough. I certainly would welcome that. And Well, enough out of me. So let me welcome Nick Petoskey once again to McDuff Lives. Welcome, Nick. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to be with you again. And hi, everybody. I know I know we've had some fun streams recently. Got some feedback about the last one about AZT. And tonight we're going to shift over a little bit into this domain, moving further backwards in time from the 80s back to the 50s and 60s. But I look forward to sharing what we've got, and this is a thinking cap session tonight, in that we're not going to drag you through a whole lot of peer-reviewed papers, but what I will do is offer you the river from which you can drink if you are thirsty. I've aggregated a whole lot of material, and because of just the scope of the number of papers involved, I've chunked it up into volumes. So we'll take a look at that, and we'll talk about the bigger framework, sort of the scientific era that gave rise to this, which helps us sort of keep several different events in public health in context, understand how they connect together back at the hub.
And it's very interesting, that you are you have an incredible amount of depth on this subject, and you've collated it very well on a Zotero page, which you're going to be sharing with us, and we're going to go through. I've asked you to kind of get me started because I haven't poked around in on your webpage yet to see what there is, but there's a number of articles there. So perhaps if you would, let's you pick a starting place and let's get into it.
Well, sure thing. Before we look at Zotero content, which is, folks, it's a big database of these scientific papers. For those of you in bench science or clinicians or research, you've seen a number of different tools that you can use to create and manage your collections. For those of you that aren't reading this kind of stuff, it's a framework that gives you a couple of powerful sort of preview tools and navigation tools that we all sort of expect now when we get on the internet to do anything, to read or to find out about a product or to order something. It has search, which we'll take a look at, and then there's a great deal of metadata or summary data about each paper, and that's where there are some gaps. You can't get full metadata on a lot of things just right off the bat, but everything in the collection that we look at is a link out to the source journal. So if this is something that you really want to, get in embroiled in, you can export this entire collection that is up on Zotero. It's an open source scientific collaboration platform. And you can then, at your leisure, pick and choose what you'd like to see in full text. And one way around the pay per view of a scientific paper is to simply attend any university that has a medical school, and you can check ahead to see the journals. If you're looking at a particular journal like virology, you can make sure that they've got the subscription, and then you can go on campus and get access to full text. So there are ways around this. You should not be doling out $40 an article for this stuff. Just want to kind of set expectations. So let's talk about that big framework that I mentioned. There's an era that intersects research science and human, we'll say, pharmacology and experimental science. And it has a name, and that's called medical primatology. It was such an important era in not just US, but global science and pharmacology, that it has its own journal, the Journal of Medical Primatology. Now, I find digital copies of that material out on the Internet Archive. And quite often, someone has deposited an excellent, interesting issue that has some very eye opening, sort of eye popping research topics in it. One of those examples that is quite overwhelming, but it makes the point, John, when I share it with clinicians who are unfamiliar with any of this, is I pull up a paper on a direct transfusion experiment between a human coma patient and a living chimpanzee. and there was all kinds of exchanges and, kind of a superhighway between the primate biology and human biology across different vectors or avenues like transplantation, potential tissue or blood that could be used from a chimpanzee source used in a human source. They didn't contextualize why we would need to go and do that when there's so many people in the world that we could get those materials from. But that was sort of the storefront of medical primatology. And within that, we see part of this, I call it a bifurcation about the story of Simian virus 40, SV40, our topic for tonight. And that major split in one version of reality versus another is very simple. Does it cause cancer, or is it involved in cancer, or doesn't it? And there's been a public and a private sort of dichotomy to which version of reality you hear. If it's private, if you're an investigator, if you're a bench scientist, a researcher, and I'm not talking about your medical doctor or even your dermatologist, or someone that might potentially intersect with simian virus 40 or one of these primate viruses. I'm talking about people that modify viruses, that study microbiology, that study disease mechanisms, and they're working with cell culture and things like that. They would all be generally pretty familiar with the fact that you can order live simian virus 40 today and bring it into your laboratory environment. And in the course of introducing it to a cell culture or to a test animal, you can initiate cancer. So that's how it's been used in the private context all of these years. In the public space, John, SV40 doesn't have anything to do with cancer.
So you're saying that people who are in the know can order some SV40, and they have shown historically that, yeah, if you want to give some animal cancer for an experiment that you want to run, that's one way that you can do it. Do I understand you correctly?
You do, and the
Wow.
15,000 plus papers in the simian virus 40 directories that I've aggregated here can speak to that, outside of my lack of clinical certification, right? I am not a bench investigator. I'm coming before you tonight as a medical anthropologist. So I have a degree, a certain amount of comprehension of the technicalities of the science they're working on. You have to in order to recognize what it is. I could not repeat these laboratory experiments myself, but the language that they use and the results and conclusions and objectives of each of these investigations is quite informative in a way that will not match up with anything that you look up from Newsweek or Time Magazine, or any of the major, any major media outlet that has chosen to weigh in on SV40 or the SV40 debate. And they always throw up their hands and say, well, we're just journalists, so we'll let the biologists keep exploring this. But in the meantime, from the get go, from the very first time that Dr. Stewart and Dr. Eddy are heroes who tried to blow the whistle and protect public health and did exactly what we would hope a public health official would do. As soon as they began seeing the evidence of this in the mid 50s and began having other colleagues reproduce and confirm, yep, we've got something in a number of commercial products that is causing cancer in test animals. From that point forward, there should have been an alarm and an arrest of that practice in science and pharmacology. There should have been no quarter to turning in another direction. And there are all sorts of investigations that occurred around this at a time, at a point in the time frame about 1958 to 1961. We could go back and find congressional discussions about it, scientific publications about it. But what occurred is the beginning, in my opinion, of really the best evidence as to why the NIH, the CDC, the NIAID, and the NCI, along with a lot of other, smaller components of public health, should be redressed fully top down, and we really need to restructure. I think it's evidence of a betrayal of the very point of the institution, the very reason that it's supposed to be there, at least out on Main Street. That's what the pamphlet says. But in the meantime, as the SV40 contamination became very well known and the scope of the exposure in the population became quantifiable, people like Dr. Hilary Kaprowski said, and I don't have his quote here in front of me, but I'll paraphrase. He said that tens of millions of people around the world we know have had live SV40 exposure. And that was just the beginning of it. They should have shut primate materials down in the production of human pharmacology, but instead they let it continue.
And there is a quote from Alan Dulles that he just said, he bemoaning it's a shame that we can't find more human volunteers for our research, and that plus the pressure from the foundation, the foundations that fund the research by and large. And I'm referring, of course, to the Rockefeller Foundation and others that are like that. Would have had There was just this huge political focus on polio that had been created, even with FDR, the March of Dimes, and this huge political pressure to solve the polio problem. And these people addressed it with the vaccine technology, but obviously they were not as careful as one would like them to have been. But in terms of the actual, question, does it cause cancer or not? One thing that Ed Haslam provided in his book, and just if people want to look it up, it's on page 213. There's three graphs, the cancer epidemic, and he's showing the cancer epidemic increases from 1973 to 1987, I believe. And uh, I don't think you could see these charts if I held them up, but well, anyway, you can see that there's charts there, and they track the four soft tissue cancers, and the rise is really just frightening. Um, the breast cancer is also going up like astronomically, and maybe you can see that this is the breast cancer going up over time. But this book only goes up to about 1987 in his terms of the data that he had at the time. Um, you've looked through a lot of research papers, and I think it's a key question of, has more data been amassed as to the incidence of cancer among people who took the Sabine vaccine?
Well, if I were questioning someone providing their expert witness deposition, I would be calling into the case individuals who might be named in these scientific papers, including just contemporaries. We don't need to get Dr. Stanley Plotkin back up on the stand to get some square answers about the well-known, extremely well-established function of oncogenic or cancer-causing viruses like SV40 in research. And then what's probably most important is that we would understand the papers that framed up who paid for their different activities. We could explore and examine the ethics of, was this a human experiment? Was there ever a contamination event of your materials into other work or experiments in your laboratory work group, as was the case a lot during the HeLa contamination era? A whole lot of things we still don't even know. Were there results at all legitimate, or was it a completely biased and modified outcome because there was a contamination of a cancer-causing cell line that got into their materials? There's all sorts of nuance about what we could ask an SV40 scientist or a microbiologist or a virologist. There are a number of people who work with these kinds of materials. And a contemporary voice would be able to confirm for us quite clearly the functions and the mechanisms of SV40 involved in the progression, the emergence, and the disease process of a number of human cancers. And we can pull out any number of pathology papers, epidemiology papers, genetics, oncology, hematology, transplantation. These are some of the scientific domains that I have seen. Very important and specific findings published about SV40 found in or contaminating a variety of human medical procedures and research.
Here's another question I had. From what you can see, or from your point of view, do you know whether it's possible for me to, with a DNA sample, to determine whether I have SV40 in my blood?
We tonight are going to go as one of our train stops here on the Whistle Stop Express. We're going to stop in at a website called the ATCC. And this is one of those little nothing burger pieces of American society and science and health, because that's what it all relates to, that most people don't know. About 99.x don't have any idea what this thing is. They never heard of it. They didn't realize what it has to do with their life, their health, their body. And the ATCC is the American Tissue Culture Collection. There are a small network of these facilities, and
Wow.
there are other companion entities that provide the same kinds of services. Primarily, I see we can reduce what their products and services are down to three major categories. One, specific DNA tests for all of these horrifying viruses and, RNA, DNA viruses, things like that. They are a test manufacturer. Two, you get cell culture from them. Think about a sourdough loaf and getting a piece of the mother loaf. That's what you're getting from them. You get cell culture from a rabbit, or you cell culture from a monkey or from a horse to do a particular targeted investigation. Three, they keep a massive library, and yes, you can get live RNA and DNA viruses and other kinds of microorganisms from them. And that is where there is so much interesting history. And if we were to FOIA an entity before the evidence vanished, it should be the ATCC. Just FOIA everything we can from the 1950s to the 1990s. And then we can march in all kinds of scientific experts like a Dr. Judy Mikovits or a Dr. Kevin McKernan, who's a genetics specialist who's now looking at that SV40 promoter gene that was found during the sequencing work. Which is another piece of another piece of the puzzle that fits together with the earlier exposures of either these vaccine associated or what they call wild type SV40 exposures in the human population.
You mentioned Kevin McKernan, and I was particularly moved by a video collection of him and Dr. Baxti. I think he's a Thai uh, origin, but lives in Germany, and he's one of the great experts in virology. And he and McKernan were both very concerned about the serum in which the vaccines, or at least some of them, were. They thought they of course said that there's nothing wrong with the serum in which the vaccine is contained, but he's found indications that that's wrong, and I was very shocked by that. And I sent that to a friend of mine who will remain anonymous, and I said, this is shocking. You should look at this, and I'm very concerned about it. And they just sent me back like, no, that's just one of those conspiracy theories. And they referred me to uh, the publication This Week in Virology. And of course, Me having been following Mark Kulak's work and David Underdown's work for so long, I immediately became suspicious because I know these names and I know that this is the narrative that they're trying to spin people to, but the people do indulge in it anyway and find themselves comforted by having someone say that no, that's just a conspiracy theory or words to that effect, and that's where we're stuck with the a number of these issues, but certainly the SV40 issue comes to the fore. I My own personal anecdote again, if I may, and that is when I met with my the radiologist, the oncology radiology guy that does the direct beam radiation, and otherwise was treating me. And I think he was a great doctor and did a good job. But I talked to him about my father and the fact that I thought his death by cancer was very suspicious, and I handed him this book, and I said, "Would you mind taking a look at this book? I'd really appreciate it." And he wouldn't look at it. He said, "No, no, we get our information, through professional sources, and but thank you." But he wouldn't take the book from me. So that was back in 2017 when I started my journey with
Hmm.
this stuff. And now I've got a younger, newer doctor that's treating me. And I, when I first met him, when I talked to him recently, I asked him, I said, this SV40 as a promoter in these vaccines is starting to hit the news. Uh, have you seen that? And he was like very vague on, I said SV40. He said, what was that's that from those vaccines back in the 50s, wasn't it? And he was completely, unaware of any concerns about SV40 whatsoever. And you know, this is a young, I think probably rarely on the ball, but typical doctor who's they just don't look outside, their lines. They stay in their lane, and it's our job now to try to present stuff, and I'm sure you can help to break through that, and let's get some serious doctors taking these issues as seriously as you are.
Well, thank you for that bringing that into focus of the well-meaning, but apparently, we'll say they are acolytes. They are brand new to the concept, and they have a rear view mirror perspective on what this issue is, whether or not it has anything to do with modern health, any of that. But I'm finding that across the spectrum of many allopathic clinicians, there is a very, very strong fence about what is the standard of care. And what I'll tell you what I mean by that. Very recently, for the first time in my life, a clinician pulled back the curtain on one of those diagnostic, essentially decision trees. And when your doctor looks at you and asks you some questions and looks over his glasses and and makes some notes on his chart and says, "I'll be right back." This is one of the resources that is in that right back 2 to 5 minutes that you sit there, in a gown shivering on the metal table. Is they're going and getting a little bit of data, getting essentially maybe a game plan of what your symptomology and perhaps any already available clinical or bench test data can inform them to try and frame up for you, what does it look like? This is what we think is happening, and this is what's next. And it breaks down the steps that they're supposed to do next, the testing that would be appropriate as primary and confirmatory, the procedures and pharmacology, certainly, that should immediately be considered as a part of your treatment. And it's truly a recipe book. Now, I don't know about how stringent the lines are about straying from the path. Can a clinician be elective? Can they be an integrated medicine practitioner and consider phytotherapies instead of pharmatherapies? Consider an infectious etiology as a root cause instead of driving someone towards a cancer surgery, something like that. I think that there are those that do it quietly, secretly. I think there are clinicians who get to do it as naturopathic doctors and chiropractors and doctors of functional and integrated medicine. There's a spectrum of providers that it blows my mind, John, is that the the real healers in the big spectrum of medical providers, I think, are the ones who really are dogged about root cause. They don't want to see you. They don't want you to keep buying supplements and pills. They want to get you back into a state of homeostasis. And it seems there's a bias that those kinds of practitioners are getting, in a mechanized way and a very systematic plan, elbowed out of the ability to provide care unless you can just pay, everything on top of whatever medications, whatever therapies, et cetera, because your HMO says, sorry, that's out of network. That's the kind of thing. By the way, friends, that's not a hopeless circumstance. Use your there's a pre-tax exclusion and use your, I think it's called an HSA account, because you can invest that money if you don't use it, and you can use it with a debit card at your discretion, whether they're in or out of your network. And as long as you're spending it on wellness therapies, whatever it would be, it's at your discretion. So that's one of the loopholes that came through in the last few years that I know is helpful in that space.
Well, it's interesting. I see we have one of our chat room members, Karma Doc, is saying that some of us take it seriously, and I
Hmm.
appreciate that, and I'm sure that's true. And I'm looking forward to having another go at my current urologist to see if we can get him interested. The recent withdrawal of a page from the CDC website caught my attention, and that was, it was informative about, yes, there was a generation of people that took uh, this particular polio vaccine, and there is SV40 in it, and they admit it right there on the website. Um, but then the CDC apparently took that page down. So again, we're talking about SV40 not only in the context of what happened to those of us back in the 60s that took it, but also in the context of what Nick just mentioned, and that is that it comes up as a quote unquote promoter, and that it's not the whole virus, it's just a snippet of this virus that apparently some of these drug makers think is useful as a whatever a promoter is to help them in the efficacy of the vaccines. Um, at least that's what they say. Um, Nevertheless, we have other people that are saying uh, that's uh, uh, that's pretty sketchy. I mean, maybe you're not putting the whole virus in, but how do you know that that's safe? And I think maybe they're trying to hide, this type of discussion in order to not have to confront that question. That's my suspicion. Anyway, do you understand this controversy over putting SV40 parts of the virus in as something called a promoter, and what that's supposed to do?
I have the beginnings of an understanding of that, and it would take us several shows just to trudge our way through from the 1960s to today in the variety of applications, hybridization, and subunits, smaller pieces of SV40 that have been employed in investigative and experimental work. There's a whole lot of technical stuff to unpack there. We don't all have to become microbiologists to do that. But what I would say, let's boil it down to a simple beginning risk. What is something we can all wrap our arms around? If we have an existing SV40 infection in our body, what we understand about it, at least in its relationship, I'm not saying causality, its relationship to a number of human cancers, is a long latency period. There isn't a rash. You don't get specks. You don't have necessarily some primary debilitating condition that comes on before it's playing a role in switching off all of your own natural defenses against cancer. You have multiple
Oh,
mechanisms. We're not unpacking human oncology tonight, but that's primarily what SV40 will do after some time. Now, very recently, I had a loved one come forward and say that she has lung cancer, and we talked about you know the experience of getting that news. What are the next steps? What do we know clinically versus hand waving that's been done by an oncologist so far? What is in black and white in front of you versus things, impressions you've been given, and try to just get grounded about going through that sort of news. I went back to my own SV40 materials and found an amazing chart that shows the entire cascade of different. There's different. This is going to get a little weird. Kind of like when Ant-Man shrink.
uh-oh, what happened? Oh, I think we tried to maybe tried to share something and hello. Oh, I'm sorry, folks. We've lost Nick for a moment. Uh-oh.
John, can you hear me?
All right, Nick, are you back? I'm here. I hear you. Can you hear me? Nick.
Hmm.
All right, Nick, I'm here. Can you hear me? Nick, I hear you. Open your
Testing 1 2.
I hear you, Nick. I hear you.
Testing 1 2 3.
I got you.
I
I
toggled
got you.
my VPN point. Okay,
Here.
great. Sorry about that.
Do you hear me?
I do, loud and clear.
All right. Well, then we're back together. I don't know what happened, but we're back.
Well, we won't make any assumptions about that. Technology has all kinds of hiccups, so we won't read into it. So we have at this point, generally, I know we need to start thinking about putting our seat belts in the upright, seat backs in the upright position, and put our tray tables up. Are we ready to take a look at this directory? And I'll give really just a quick summary review. Say, okay, folks, this is how it's organized. Here is how you can search it. Here's how you can peruse it. And then we'll take a look at one early paper that should give a pretty clear indication that they understood exactly how oncogenic this virus was back in the 60s.
Awesome. All right.
Okay, okay. And I'm going to present again. So I'm sharing out. Let's try this again. Share screen. Window. There we go. Okay. Are you seeing the
All right.
content?
Gotcha. And there we are.
Okay. So folks, for right now, don't worry about getting URLs or details or anything. If you are enjoying this on the computer, please just put us up to full screen, full size. I'm just going to pull up one paper after I give a brief tour. So this is called a Zotero. This is a tool that is managed. It's an open source platform that any of you can use. And really, it's used primarily for research collections. So you can vary, just like all your folders and any number of platforms, you can label and organize your stuff. And the nice thing is that when you have a Zotero, there is a companion web page Right now, we're looking at the web page. This is the actual public web version of all of my collections. You manage it with a similar tool that looks just like this on your desktop, and then you synchronize. So this is the Simian virus 40 materials that I've collected. We have so many that I broke them up into chunks of 1,000 papers per
Oh,
volume.
goodness.
So there are 15,000 plus citations here in the SV40 files
Oh
that are
my,
organized with timestamps. And this is very important if you really want to understand what did we know in 1963?
yeah.
What did we know at this point in time, et cetera, et cetera? And you can just work your way forward. So there are two major directories. Again, there was so many. In order for it to not freeze up on the web page, that's why I sliced it up like this. So it's searchable. You just put your cursor up here and search anybody. You can search for Fauci. You can search for SV40. You can search for cancer. Here's a tip, something that you may not know as you're reading these early papers about experiments with viruses in an attempt to cause leukemias, sarcomas, lymphomas, and solid tumor cancers. The key word to keep in mind that you may not have known is transform, or the gerund form transforming. When they talk about X virus transforming cells, that means that it has successfully initiated the cancer process. That's what they're talking about. That'll help you navigate a lot of this stuff. Right now, we're going to look at one selection from 1963. And like any type of a tabular interface like this, you can click on a column header and pivot things alphabetically by the authors. That generally the lead scientist or investigator is the first name, and I use this the most, the date column. So if you want to, if you're doing a timeline, you can work your way forward. We're going to look at a paper called Tumors Induced in Hamsters by Simian virus 40, Persistent Subviral Infection. Now I've clicked once on this here on my Zotero, and then it focuses over here. You guys know what, this is very, very familiar type of layout, different panes. You got your left and your right nav. Well, you'll get your metadata over here on the right. Let's take a look at the abstract very quickly. The cells of two hamsters, ependymomas, it's a type of cancer, originally induced by cerebral inoculation with simian virus 40 in newborn animals, have been serially cultured in vitro, which means serially cultured means repeatedly cultured again and again, and in vitro means in the test tube. In vivo means in the body. So, next sentence. None of the virus was detected in cell-free culture fluids or cell lysates. So they didn't find free-floating SV40. Final sentence, no, third sentence. All cells retained their neoplastic potential when newborn hamsters were inoculated. Let's pause there. All of the SV40 cells that they were testing, when they took them and injected them into another newborn hamster, were successful in causing cancer. That's what that means. Final sentence. Data suggest that viral nucleic acid is permanently present in some tumor cells. That's what I mean by that's end quote. They understood the disease mechanism. They understood that it was communicable through fluids, and unfortunately through sexual fluids, friends. And they knew that there would be a variable interval, a time frame between initial infection and the potential onset of cancer. So this was the beginnings. This is in the first few years of really beginning to fiddle with SV40. We don't have time tonight to go through all of the papers and watch the quite refined and mind-boggling applications of bits and pieces of SV40 in other platforms like vaccine platforms. But coming back to your question, John, about the significance of Kevin's findings and other investigators who are confirming SV40 promoter sequences in some of these new biological products, is the unknown synergistic or activating effect that it might have on a permanently infected cell that might have been sitting quietly in your organs, your body someplace for years and years and years and years, and your natural anti-apoptosis, your anti-tumorigenic processes, your own homeostasis protected you for years and years, and then something tipped it over, and it begins helping cancer emerge. That's where we've got a whole lot of data here, and it's a very important point in a number of big pieces that we need to take each one carefully and consider it in relation to the authority that the NIH and the CDC and the FDA continue to try to expand and expand and expand. This is deep evidence of, in my opinion, just massive, almost global malfeasance, and a complete betrayal of their mission.
The point you just made is made in a short paragraph. One of the people who read Dr. Mary's Monkey left this very, I think, succinct and important summary. He says this: in short, the polio vaccine made from monkey kidneys carried the SV40 virus, which remains dormant inside baby boomers who received the polio vaccine until the immune system is weakened to the point where the SV40 virus can transform into one of the major cancers: lung, breast, soft tissue, bone cancer, etc. Unquote.
Mm-hmm.
That to me, the knowledge that these aberrant cells that shouldn't be there, from a different, not even from our species, shouldn't be there,
Yep.
are just going to lay there until people get old or until we encounter some other dramatic thing that weakens our immune system. And, it sounds like a nice piece of information for people on the Health Alteration Committee of Alan Dulles, Richard Bissell, and those other murderers at the CIA in the 60s. Wow, this is tremendous. Thank you so much, Nick.
You're very welcome. I want to speak to that last point, to that last quote. And this is about the seriousness and the pervasiveness of this particular pathogen in human health. I have to disagree with what they asserted. And we can prove it in a number of ways through the literature, any number of methods to show, what I mean by this. You don't have the cells in your body right now that you were composed of when you ate your sugar cube, do you?
Right.
You
Okay.
know the limitations of cellular mitosis. Every cell type in the body has been replaced over the course of your life.
Okay. Sure.
So if you have a persistent SV40 infection at the age of 50, 60, 70 from something that occurred much earlier in life, what does that prove to you about whether this virus remains consistently asleep or latent, or does it perhaps go through cycles of latency and then reemergence?
Well, I
It
couldn't.
has to. It has to. Otherwise, it would die out with the cells that had died of cellular mitosis back in the 1960s. You're a whole new John. They would have been gone, but they're not. They persist. So that's the issue, and that it persists in human fluids. So that's a whole nother layer to this. We're not going to go back into that, but tonight it's important to understand that this is not something to just look at in the rear view mirror. It isn't. This was an ongoing risk. Not only did they come to understand that it was transmissible through human fluids and that it persisted over years and that it was involved in a great number of cancers, they built a cancer industry to catch everybody as they went into the experience of finding out a diagnosis and then trying to do everything to fight against it. And instead of saying, let's take a look at maybe interrupting the life cycle of an RNA virus or a DNA virus that might be at the root of this, they say, thank you, welcome, here's a cup of coffee, let's schedule you for chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation. That's the Rockefeller formula. So
Mm.
that's another big piece of the framework that we're not going to ignore. It's a real contemporary issue, and I would invite you. I will go out on Twitter and again repeat my Zotero link. It's in my profile, so you can just click that link right there and find all the papers that we were looking at. But please think forward. Think about how to clear this from your body. Think about people who are doing investigations of new innovative ways to collapse and control and eliminate the life cycle of viruses like this. And remain there. There's an amount of anger and betrayal. The truth will piss you off, but there's also a
Uh-oh, sounds like we've lost our audio with Nick. Well, I'll tell you, I have experienced that anger, and I'm so far so good. I'm going to have a what's called a PET scan in uh, in a week and a half. Until then, nothing really to report. I no, I'm not feeling bad about it. I'm not having any symptoms. It's just that suddenly got a spike in the PSA, which is very concerning to my doctor. So, seeing all of this stuff in the news and reporting from our colleagues from the Winburn uh, and other investigations that are going on right now at the same time, it seems like perhaps now is the time that we can join together and find some answers to this. And wow, Nick has just done an amazing, wonderful job of collating all of these articles, which I'm going to ask him once again to come back and help guide me through his collection. And I want to explore more about what he was saying at the end about it's obviously it's going to have to regenerate itself somehow to uh, to exist over all of those years. Interesting and informative, and I'm very grateful to Nick Petoskey for being with me tonight. And thank you all for being with me as well. I look forward to talking to you. If you're free, join us at 11 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow for McDuff's Friday chat. And we'll talk about all of the interesting things that have been going on in the past week or two. Thanks again, and we'll see you tomorrow.